as Member of Parliament for North Vancouver from 2004 to 2008. Don introduced and had the Rare Disorders Bill passed, all three readings, and accepted by Parliament, and Don will tell you the rest of the story.
Thank you. Is this going to work now, and all I have to do is press? Oh. I do have some slides to go here, not many, but you'll have to apologize for them. It was my first effort at actually producing my own PowerPoint. I used to have staff that did that for me. So when I do it myself, it's very simple. That's it. Thank you. Hello, my name is Don Bell, and I had the pleasure yesterday of sitting in on the presentations by Ryan Clark of Advocacy Solutions as he explained some of the steps a society such as yours must take, certainly seeking the direction and assistance of professional advisors such as Ryan and companies such as his is a wise move as you begin to get more active in advocacy for your society and its members. And I say this as a former Member of Parliament for North Vancouver for 4 years, from 2004 to 2008. I'm here today to make you aware of a private member's motion that I was able to get approved in Parliament in May 2008, dealing with the need for Canada to develop a clear and effective policy that addresses rare disorders and the challenges faced by patients and their families and the health providers and the researchers dealing with these issues. As Ryan noted in his presentation yesterday, persons who become active in advocacy roles for social and particularly health-related organizations often do so based on their personal experience or that of a close family member or a good friend. In my case, I became interested. I get choked and even talking about it. I became interested because of my grandson, Dylan. And I just hit this, I guess. There's Dylan, who was diagnosed at age 3 with primary pulmonary hypertension, which is a rare terminal disease that affects the blood vessels of the lungs. I watched as my son and his wife dealt with living with this disease and the daily process of maintaining the intravenous backpack that Dylan wore 24 hours a day, administering the required drug treatment directly into his heart. I also saw how my young grandson adapted, as children somehow seem so well and able to do, to the discomfort and the restrictions of his disease that was imposed on his daily life at home and school. I attended a conference of the PH Society of America in 2006 with my son and grandson, where I met the president of CORD, Durhan Ron Rieger, which is the Canadian Association for Rare Disorders. Through her, I became aware of the number of other rare disorders and diseases and the lack of any federal formal policies to address them. I began working as a Member of Parliament with CORD and other groups to identify the major problems and how they could be better addressed by the federal government. My son Darren became involved in helping a number of separate provincial PH groups form into a national society for the purpose of a better coordinated approach to public awareness, advocacy, and patient information. Unfortunately, my grandson passed away during his 12th birthday party in July 2007. Following his passing, I was even more determined to carry on trying to advance the interests of patients with rare diseases as a legacy in Dylan's memory. Members of Parliament from all political parties are afforded an opportunity to present what are called private members' bills or motions directly for a vote of Parliament. It used to be that such motions had to have the approval of the government, but a number of years ago the procedure was changed, which entitled all members of Parliament from all parties to be able to present what is called a private member's motion or a private member's bill and have it voted on by Parliament even if the government of the day doesn't agree. Such bills or motions cannot require the government to spend any money. In the U.S., if a congressman puts a bill forward, it can recommend that a certain amount of money be spent for a medical situation, such as the case in pulmonary hypertension. Both a Republican and a Democrat got together and presented a bill that created funding for that disease. But in Canada, such bills and motions cannot require the government to spend any money, as this is the sole prerogative of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to propose a federal budget and a spending program, which is then hopefully approved by Parliament. From a practical perspective, there can only be a few dozen such private members' bills or motions dealt with at any given time, and a simple lottery draw of approximately the 270 non-cabinet members of Parliament from all the parties takes place to determine the actual timing of when a particular member's item will become before Parliament. So they virtually put all 270 names in a hat, they draw them out, and you're given a number. I was given the number 108. And they take approximately 25 private members' motions or bills at a time, and they work those through Parliament, and when they've been adopted or defeated, they bring another 25 in. And the challenge is, the first time I was in Parliament, my number was, I think, about 225, so I didn't have a hope. By the time we were somewhere around 100, an election was called, and so the list died. And the second sitting I was in, when I got re-elected, I went back, and my number was 108. And so I was watching anxiously as the bills were proceeding, hoping that I would get my motion before Parliament, before an election took place or the House was prorogued. I chose to present a motion rather than a bill, and you've heard of private members' bills. There's a difference between a bill and a motion. Motions are not as complicated as bills procedurally, and they have a much better chance of being approved because bills have to be vetted by the ministries involved, whereas motions don't. So it meant that I was able to submit it and not have to have it cleared for legalities, if you want to call it. I submitted it in December of 2007. My motion was debated on August the 14th and again on May the 6th, 2008, and it was approved by Parliament on May the 7th, 2008. My original motion contained 8 action-oriented recommendations based on discussions with CORD, but had to be amended and softened to be less specific to get the support of the Conservative government. The Bloc said they supported the objectives of my motion, but they wanted an opportunity written in that Quebec could receive the funding and opt out of any of the programs if they decided to, which unfortunately is something that they do quite commonly. I could not agree to this for what I considered to be a national program, and it needed a national solution. In the end, my amended motion was approved by all 221 Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP members present. It was unanimous except for 38 Bloc members who voted against it. The motion called on the government to undertake 7 specific actions and to report back within 12 months on the progress, any progress that they'd made. That would have been a reporting date of May 2009, but to this day, even though all Conservative members supported the motion, no such report has been made by government. Unfortunately for me and my motion, I was not re-elected in October 2008. Also in September of that year, at the beginning of the election campaign, I suffered a heart attack and had 2 stents placed in my heart. My health and cardio rehabilitation did not allow me to pursue follow-up to the motion as aggressively as I would have liked. And the realities of shuffling of government priorities following the election and all the political drama that followed, including the proroguing of Parliament by the Prime Minister, meant other issues became top of mind for both government and the opposition parties. A letter was sent by one of my friendly members of Parliament in February 2009 to the new Minister of Health asking for a status report, and a reply was finally received some 5 months later in August that spoke more in generalities with no specific mention of the items in my motion. CORD, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, tried to raise the issue in 2009, but ran up against the same political chaos that had followed. And I'll give you an update. I've just spoken with Durhan Van Rieger, the president of CORD, about 10 minutes ago. She's just come back from a conference in Europe, and she tells me there is some progress being made, and I'll detail that to you. I do believe the motion and the government's responsibility to report should and will be raised again, hopefully soon. The importance of this motion to you is that CNET represents one of over 7,000 rare diseases and disorders, and I use the term intermixedly, that could benefit by action on various parts of the motion. The number one issue is to get the government to define rare disease in Canada. This is the starting point. We are the only major developed country in the world without a definition of a rare disease. And we don't have, therefore, an appropriate drug policy, because if you don't know what you're talking about, how can you have a policy about it? I'd now like to go through the motion with you and then answer a few questions if time permits. So that's the motion, and I'm going to take it in sections for you and then try to explain it to you. Started out, and what you'll see, there's two. There's the top section and the bottom section. The bottom section is the motion that I developed and introduced with the help of CORD. The top section is how the wording finally had to be amended to get it through government and to get the support of government. I originally, if you understand Canadian politics, I figured I could do it with the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberals, and I didn't need the Conservatives. Then when the Bloc said to me that they would only support it if I put an option in that let them opt out, I said no, I had to go and cozy up to the Conservatives and try to get their support so we could get it through without, because I needed all the votes in the House to get it through. So in order to get it through the Conservatives, and I have to say they were cooperative. Stephen Fletcher, who was the assistant to the Minister of Health at that time, was very cooperative. He's the gentleman that's in a wheelchair, the only Canadian MP that's in a wheelchair, disabled. And he worked hand in glove with me to get these adoptions through. So what is passed is that in the opinion of the House, and this is the way motions are read in Parliament, the government should respond specifically to the challenges faced by Canadians with rare diseases and disorders in collaboration with the provinces and territories and stakeholders, and then there are 7 points. And you can see the part that was deleted, which is the part in the second. I had made reference to the initiative put forward by CORD, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and they didn't want to have that organization mentioned directly in the motion. So the first of the issues is examining options for defining serious rare diseases. What I wanted them to do was to establish the definition for serious rare disorders as those with a prevalence of less than 1 in 2,000 in Canada. They didn't want to have a specific definition, so what I had to do was what I call weasel word it down to the point that they would look at options, examine options for defining it. Now I can tell you the definition varies from country to country. The U.S. was the first to define rare diseases 25 years ago. They have it as 1 in 200,000 of the population, which works out to about 1 of 1,350 population. Other countries vary. For example, Australia, rare is a prevalence of 1 in 15,000. But the generally accepted definition that seems to be in most countries in Europe and and Britain is 1 in 2,000, which is what CORD had recommended, and that's why I had it in the original draft. Second part of the motion is examining options, including the possible creation of a specific fund to improve access to rare disease treatments, building on recent work undertaken by federal and provincial territorial governments under the National Pharmaceutical Strategy. The original request was to examine the feasibility of a national Chance for Life Fund, and that was a term that CORD had picked up on and had championed, equivalent to 2% of the total annual public drug expenditure to be designated for therapies with rare disorders. Right now, I would say it's less than 1% that is spent of the equivalency of the national annual public drug expenditure. I just talked to Durhana, as I mentioned to you. She came back from Europe. Most of the countries, Germany, for example, is about 2.5% is used for rare disorders of their equivalency. So we've got a ways to go. The problem is that the government did not want to see a specific figure of 2%, because that would commit them to an amount. So they did talk about the possible creation of a specific fund, and they were willing to accept that. The third part of the motion was to consider the establishment of a multi-stakeholder advisory body, including the Common Drug Review, which is a government process, treaters and patients, to recommend treatment access for life-threatening or serious rare disorders based on scientific standards and social values. And that was the same as we had requested. They just added, the government had requested that we add the Common Drug Review. And again, this is to make sure that we get broad input from the people that are actually involved. The next was I wanted them to consider, if you look at the bottom, the establishment of centers of reference, if you can call them centers of excellence, but are centers of reference for specific rare disorders, so that Vancouver might be the one for pulmonary hypertension. Winnipeg could be a center for another area, and the information would be channeled through those centers, so there was a gathering place for it to happen. And what they didn't want to get into that. They agreed that they would explore options to consider national and international expert advice in developing criteria for treating patients based on scientific evidence and patient impact, and to link these activities with ongoing post-market monitoring of real-world drug safety and effectiveness. So around the world, there's these same rare disorders, and each country is dealing with it in different ways. And if we can get both the researchers and the treaters, the caregivers and the patients to channel that information in, we can share it. And the challenge with rare disorders is that the numbers are so small. In some cases, there's only 20 people in Canada that will have a particular rare disorder. Well, when you then try to have clinical trials or to gather research, it's very hard. But if you pool the information between Australia, England, Europe, the US, and Canada, then you get a number sometimes that starts to approach a meaningful number where you can start to properly evaluate treatment processes. The fifth was to consider options to encourage research and development into treatments for rare diseases and other unmet health needs. What we really wanted initially was to provide incentives through orphan drug regulation and policy to assure Canadian organizations and researchers are motivated to conduct research and development. One of the problems we've got is we're losing first quality researchers from Canada to other countries because we don't provide the support that's needed here. Oops. Next is to consider internationally accepted standards for conduct of clinical trials in rare disorders appropriate for the challenges inherent to very small patient populations. The only difference in the motion between what I wanted and what I had to settle for was going from a more positive word of supporting to saying considering. But basically, this is the issue I talked about the small numbers of people available for actual clinical trials. Then the next was considering how Health Canada's work on a progressive licensing framework could provide appropriate support for the design of clinical trials for very small patient populations, and appropriate review of evidence submitted from these trials. And this sort of follows on the last motion I mentioned to and the comment I made about clinical trials. What I'd hoped was that we would say that it would ensure that this happens, and the motion that we settled for is to examine how it could happen. Finally, and this was the easy part, reporting the progress accomplished to the House of Commons within 12 months. I originally wanted 6 months. They said we need 12 months. It's now over 2 years and there's been no report. Since that time, one of my colleagues from Vancouver area wrote a letter in February of 2008 anticipating that the 12-month period would be coming up in May of 2008 and asked what the government had done and would they be ready to report. The minister replied, and it's very small, you can't see it, but I just had it there, was sort of the usual response from government that we are very concerned about the problems you face. We're doing a lot in various areas, and thank you for your inquiry. What I wanted to say to you is that the problem we've got is that policy for rare disorders has to be based on the principle of equitable provision of health care. And that's something that most Canadians assume is an unshakable element of our universal health care system. But in the case of rare disorders, the principle of universality is currently missing. In rare disorders, I talked about them affecting 8%, that's 1 in 12 people, 12%, I'm sorry, 1 in 8 people, 1 in 12 people, is either a carrier of a rare disease or is a, for want of a better term, a patient or a victim of a rare disease, is suffering from a rare disease directly. That's over 2.5 million Canadians. And in this room, it would be disproportionate, but if you were to go into any normal gathering of people, it's 1 in 12 people. And when you realize that, that's pretty significant. Why isn't more been done before? Rare disorders include conditions, under that definition of 1 in 2,000, include conditions such as cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, Legionnaire's disease, muscular dystrophy, thalassemia, MPS, which is mucopolysaccharidosis, I think, pulmonary hypertension, Fabry's disease, Gaucher's disease, ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease, Waldenstrom's anemia, AIDS, and acromegaly, to name a few. Some of the cancers are also, cancer generally is very common, but many of the cancer diseases, such as the one you're here for, they're rare diseases by that definition. Rare diseases can be acquired or genetic, as you probably know, and it's important to note that several rare disorders fall within more common conditions. And I mentioned the issue of cancer, whereas kidney cancer, for example, is a rare disease, would be considered one. Now you say you've heard of many of these things. You've heard of Lou Gehrig's disease. You've heard of cystic fibrosis. They're not rare. They are rare by the definition of 1 in 2,000 of the number of people that have it. But what they've had is very good advocacy groups who have raised the profile so you're aware of them. So basically, I wanted to say to you that access to medication for Canadians with rare disorders has been described as trying to untangle a Gordian knot, and is the greatest challenge faced by those with rare disorders. You all know how the Gordian knot was solved. Somebody cut through it with a sword. And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to get to the point where we cut through the knot or the crap and get some action happening. Now, to tell you an update, I just spoke to Durhan, and she tells me good news. I have it right here on a napkin. I was standing with my cell phone. On June the 3rd, they have a meeting with the Standing Committee on Health, and that they have been working with the staff, not the politicians, on the draft regulatory framework, and they are starting to see a number of those 7 requirements of my motion are being developed, answers are being developed. So I was prepared to tell you what could you do. You could get in touch with your Member of Parliament and let them know that you're affected or a family member is affected by a rare disorder and that you want to see action on the motion. But I'm going to also suggest that your organization work in relationship with CORD, and that Durhan, in the conversation I had with her a moment ago, said that she would be happy to fill you in on the most recent information she has. And I will provide whatever assistance I can from my knowledge of the process of government to help CORD and any organization that wants to get somewhere with government. So thank you very much.